Iran used 8,000 landmines to stop U.S. Rangers. How they captured IRGC missile commander near Hormuz. Before dawn, the Persian Gulf looked calm enough to fool satellites. Black water. Flat wind. Tanker lanes glowing faintly beyond the Strait of Hormuz like arteries carrying the world's pulse. And under that stillness, buried in tidal flats, salt marsh, beach approaches, and narrow causeways, Iran had laid a killing field. 8,000 landmines meant to do one thing: break any assault force before it ever reached the missile belt guarding the strait. The message was simple. If the Americans came for the launch network, they would not find a battlefield. They would find a grave. But that night, the men moving toward the Iranian coastline were not coming to hold ground. They were coming to remove a single mine from the machine. The target was more dangerous than the launchers themselves. Deep inside a hardened command zone near Hormuz, an IRGC missile commander was overseeing a dispersed anti-ship architecture built for strategic blackmail: mobile coastal batteries, hidden radar teams, decoy positions, fiber-linked fire control nodes, and fast-response crews ready to choke maritime traffic in minutes. Oil, insurance, shipping, diplomacy, deterrence, everything bottlenecked through that corridor. In Washington, London, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and on every bridge of every tanker captain passing through the strait, the same fear existed in different languages. If one coordinated missile salvo slipped through, the region would not just burn. It would convulse. Markets would seize. Fleets would mobilize. The Gulf would become a live wire stretched across the global economy. Iran believed the geography made the system untouchable. And geography, for years, had been its silent ally. The coast there is not a clean invasion map of open sand and obvious roads. It is broken, deceptive, and cruel. Mudflats that swallow weight. Razor rock shelves. Heat-blasted ridgelines. Salt pans that amplify light. Fishing settlements masking surveillance posts. Inlets narrow enough to channel boats into preset kill zones. Then came the mines, layered in belts, staggered near likely landing points, seated inland along likely avenues of approach, and integrated with observation teams who didn't need to stop an assault everywhere. They only needed to stop it once. One blast. One choke point. One moment of confusion. Then rockets, heavy machine guns, and swarming boats would do the rest. That was the confidence inside the IRGC perimeter in the final hours before the raid. The commander at the center of it all had built his reputation on asymmetry, never matching the United States ship for ship or plane for plane, but forcing every superior enemy to bleed time, certainty, and nerve. He trusted concealment more than armor, mobility more than mass, and fear more than firepower. Under his direction, missile launchers never stayed exposed longer than minutes. Command orders moved through couriers and buried lines. Dummy sites multiplied faster than satellite passes. And now, with the minefields in place, he believed he had done more than defend the coast. He believed he had psychologically sealed it. He believed no elite force would risk crawling through 8,000 hidden detonators just to reach him. Then the first rupture came, not from the sea, but from certainty itself. Hours before the operation, Iranian sensors registered signals that looked like preparation for a conventional maritime feint farther west. Patrol craft shifted. Coastal observers leaned in the wrong direction. Small command decisions, each reasonable on its own, began hollowing out the very sector that mattered most. That is how confidence dies in modern war, not in a dramatic revelation, but in 1,000 invisible manipulations. By the time the defenders understood that the real threat was not a battalion-sized assault but a surgical decapitation strike, the force designed to find gaps in impossible defenses was already moving. They were U.S. Army Rangers, attached to a joint task force built for speed, deniability, and violence delivered on a stopwatch. Not a large formation. Not a force meant to conquer terrain. A blade. Ranger assault elements were paired with explosive ordnance specialists, signals exploitation teams, a combat controller cell coordinating overhead fires, and a small intelligence package carrying the last, best map of a coastline nobody could fully trust. Above and beyond them, unseen, unheard by the men on the beach, orbited the rest of the architecture. Surveillance platforms parsing movement patterns, electronic warfare assets muddying local awareness, naval shooters holding offshore, and aviation crews waiting for a narrow window to turn precision into shock. The Rangers were the part history remembers. But like all such missions, they moved inside a cathedral of support built in silence. The preparation for the raid had not begun with maps. It had begun with fragments. A shifted patrol schedule. A courier route that briefly overlapped a known launcher dispersal area. Heat signatures appearing where no permanent barracks existed. Maritime drone footage showing unusual vehicle discipline near a coastal service road. Intercepts too brief to mean anything alone, but meaningful when layered together. Analysts built the picture inch by inch until a pattern emerged. The commander was using a hardened support compound near a ridge above the shoreline as a temporary battle node, close enough to direct missile teams, hidden enough to survive preemptive strikes. That window would not stay open. He was due to move again. Capture, if it came at all, would come in one night and in one burst. Then came the hardest problem, the mines. 8,000 of them did not mean 8,000 neat symbols on a map. It meant uncertainty in every step, every shadow, every dune line, every berm. Anti-personnel mines. Anti-vehicle mines. Improvised supplements laid to catch the overconfident and the methodical alike. Some belts were deliberate, some deceptive, some designed only to channel intruders toward pre-sighted fire. No commander sane enough to wear the burden would send men blindly into that. So the mission planners did what elite units do when obstacles are meant to freeze thought. They stopped thinking in terms of crossing the field whole. They broke it apart. Air reconnaissance identified seams in terrain usage. Tidal analysis exposed where heavy emplacement was less likely. Pattern studies revealed which approaches Iranian observers watched hardest, and which ones they watched just enough to suggest a bluff. The minefield stopped being a wall. It became a language. The insertion began under moonless conditions with the Gulf breathing slow against the rocks. Offshore, engines stayed low and profiles stayed dark. The first movement belonged not to the Rangers but to the shadows ahead of them. Small reconnaissance elements and unmanned systems slipping close to shore, confirming what no screen could fully promise. The water was warm, the gear heavy, and every second stretched by the knowledge that one wrong pressure point would announce them in flame. When the assault force finally moved inland, it did not surge. It crept. Men spaced carefully, following marked lanes so narrow they looked, in night optics, less like paths and more like acts of faith. Nobody rushed. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The loudest sound was breathing filtered through discipline. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists before violence, when professionals know exactly how bad it will become if timing breaks. On that coastline, the silence sharpened around every boot placement. Rangers slid between patches of disturbed soil and untouched crust, stepping where the reconnaissance teams had stepped, then where the lead breachers indicated, then where the terrain itself whispered that human instinct would most likely choose wrong. In places they cut through wire. In others they bypassed entire belts by crawling along jagged stone close enough to the surf to taste the salt spray. Once, a man froze over a pressure plate half revealed in moonshadow and remained motionless until another hand guided him off it by the straps. One mistake could have triggered the whole coast. It never came. The approach ended beneath a rise overlooking the target compound. Through thermal sights, the place seemed almost underwhelming. Low buildings, revetments, antenna masts, a generator signature, a small motor pool, 2 outer security posts, and vehicle shelters partly disguised under netting. But this was the lie of covert war. Strategic nodes rarely announce themselves with grandeur. The deadliest places often look temporary, even forgettable, right until the moment they begin shaping nations. Inside those walls were the links between localized violence and regional coercion, firing codes, movement schedules, launch dispersal routes, authentication chains. And somewhere within them, if the intelligence held, was the commander who knew how to wake the whole system with a few ordered words. The assault opened with mathematical cruelty. Simultaneous suppression on the outer posts. Breach teams threw 2 points before defenders could determine the main effort. Communications jamming time to the first shots so that confusion arrived before the alarm fully formed. A generator cut. Floodlights dead. One building isolated with stun munitions. Another taken room by room. Rangers moved with the kind of speed that does not look fast until you try to measure it. Seconds vanished. Guards died not in cinematic chaos, but in abrupt, clinical fragments of action. Turn, identify, fire, move. An IRGC quick reaction team attempted to organize from the vehicle line and was shattered before it cleared cover. Overhead, unseen support tightened the box, ensuring no fleeing signal escaped cleanly into the night. Then came the shock the defenders had not imagined. This was not merely a strike to kill launchers or crater warehouses. It was a hunt. A command room door was blown inward. Operators were dragged off radios before coherent reports could leave the building. Laptop drives, printed codebooks, handheld devices, and map cases were stripped into collection bags almost as quickly as they were found. One corridor led to a reinforced chamber the planners had suspected but never confirmed. Inside, beneath layered blast shielding and redundant communications cabling, the Rangers found the true nerve tissue of the coastal missile architecture: targeting boards, launch sector overlays, convoy timing sheets, authentication matrices, and hardened storage cases for signal modules. The compound was not just a hideout. It was a live command spine. The commander tried to move in the confusion, and for a few seconds the entire mission hinged on recognition under stress. He was not in ceremonial dress. He was not framed by flags. He was another hard-faced man in operational gear, moving through smoke and half-light with aides and bodyguards collapsing around him. But the intelligence team had studied gait, posture, body proportion, injury history, even how he favored one side while descending stairs. A ranger at the inner corridor made the call before the man reached the fallback exit. There was a brief exchange of gunfire. A bodyguard fell across the doorway. Another tried to trigger a dead-man demolition charge and was cut down before completing the motion. The commander was driven to the floor, restrained, identified, and pulled clear as the building shook with secondary blasts from elsewhere in the compound. What happened next shifted the mission from successful to strategically devastating. In underground storage, beyond the operations cell, the assault teams uncovered more than documents. They found missile support infrastructure prepared for rapid activation, guidance components, encrypted communications gear, preformatted maritime targeting packages, fuel handling equipment, and a logistics chain proving the network's readiness was more advanced than outside estimates had suggested. Nearby were concealed launch support vehicles and a camouflaged tunnel access point leading toward an alternate dispersal route. The compound, in other words, was not merely directing the threat. It was preserving it against air attack and enabling it to regenerate after strikes. Destroying it now would mean more than a headline. It would buy time across the entire Gulf. So the raid pivoted with the cold flexibility of a well-built plan. Exploitation teams gave their final priorities. Demolition specialists went to work. Charges were laid not for spectacle, but for structural and systems kill: communications racks, storage bunkers, power distribution, tunnel choke points, vehicle shelters, and the hardened rooms that made the site valuable. Outside the perimeter, Iranian forces were beginning to wake in concentric rings. Headlights flickered on distant roads. Sporadic fire searched the darkness from positions that still did not understand the full shape of the assault. But time in such missions is not measured by clocks. It is measured by when the enemy begins thinking clearly. The Rangers had beaten that threshold on entry. Now they had to beat it on exit. The climax came as the compound started to die. The first demolitions punched the night open from below, lifting dust, shattered concrete, and orange pressure through the seams of the earth. Antenna masts folded. Stored equipment burned with different colors as specialized materials ignited. A secondary detonation in the tunnel complex rolled through the ridge like buried thunder, collapsing sections of the escape route and taking the hidden vehicle bay with it. At nearly the same moment, precision fires struck an approaching reinforcement element on the access road, turning the would-be counterattack into a wreck of stalled metal and disordered survivors. For the men still inside the target zone, the message was final. The network had been pierced, the commander taken, and the sanctuary transformed into rubble before the system could even understand what had happened. Yet the extraction was the real test of discipline. Adrenaline makes men reckless if leadership allows it. Good units survive because leadership does not. The Rangers withdrew in sequence, captives secured, sensitive materials distributed, casualties accounted for, lanes retraced. Nobody sprinted into uncleared ground because the hard part felt over. Nobody forgot that the minefield was still there, patient and indifferent. Behind them, flames climbed into the desert air, but in front of them was the same invisible gauntlet they had crossed coming in. This time, with distant gunfire building and Iranian units casting blind fire toward probable egress routes, the pressure was worse. Still they moved methodically, one lane marker, one hand signal, one controlled breath at a time, turning professionalism into survival again and again. When the last elements reached the shoreline, the operation was not yet safe enough to call complete. Boats had to come in without presenting a clear target. Aircraft had to remain ready without exposing their hand too soon. The sea, which had hidden the insertion, now became a corridor for escape under growing threat. Tracers reached uselessly across black water from positions too late and too uncertain to matter. The Rangers loaded their prisoner, their dead, their wounded, and the harvested intelligence that would matter almost as much as the man himself. Then they slipped back into the Gulf, leaving behind a coast that had been engineered to stop them and had failed in every essential way. 8,000 mines had protected a myth. They had not protected the truth. By sunrise, the military meaning of the raid was already expanding into political consequence. The capture of an IRGC missile commander near Hormuz would not remain a tactical story for long. It would reverberate through intelligence channels, alliance consultations, naval deployments, and emergency market assessments. Regional governments would read it as proof that the coastal denial network was penetrable. Tehran would read it as something even more unsettling, that concealment, dispersion, and fear, its chosen currencies of deterrence, could be inverted against it by an opponent willing to move inside the shadow of escalation. The destroyed command site would force hurried relocation, internal suspicion, communication resets, and purges of procedure. Every launcher crew still in the field would suddenly wonder who had been seen, tracked, or compromised next. And yet the deeper aftermath lay beyond the official statements and denials. Operations like this do not merely remove personnel or destroy infrastructure. They rewrite assumptions. For years, the narrow waters of Hormuz had granted Iran a form of strategic theater, a place where geography amplified risk and risk amplified leverage. But when a force crosses mined ground, enters a defended compound, captures the commander, strips the command architecture, demolishes the site, and exits before the full defensive system can close, the lesson is not just that one position was vulnerable. The lesson is that sanctuary itself has become conditional. That realization spreads slower than an explosion, but it goes farther. It moves through staff briefings, bunker conversations, convoy schedules, and the private pauses of men who suddenly no longer trust their own maps. So in the end, the most important sound of that night was not the breach, the gunfire, or the demolition rolling through the ridge. It was the silence left behind, the silence of launchers waiting for orders that would never come, of coastal observers reporting into broken networks, of commanders realizing that the minefields, the decoys, the tunnels, the hardened rooms, and the years of preparation had not stopped the hand reaching for the center. Near Hormuz, where the world's energy passes through a corridor of salt and steel, one raid did more than capture a man. It exposed a truth every maritime empire and every regional power eventually learns. Choke points are not just places on maps. They are tests of will. And on that black stretch of coast, beneath smoke drifting over mined earth and shattered concrete, the night itself seemed to answer, "No fortress is darkest to those who already came prepared to move through the dark."